Доброго дня усім, вельмишановне панство. Ми продовжуємо нашу роботу в рамках міжнародного проєкту САДЕП. І наразі я хочу надати слово нашій координаторці проєкту Іовчевій Аліні Михайлівні. Будь ласка.
Hello to everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's special guest lecture organized by Petro Могила Black Sea National University as a part of Jean Monnet model SADEP, which is supported by the European Union. And today we are honored to be joined by Professor F.Bібер from University of Graz, who is director of the Center for Southeast European Studies and an expert in Balkan affairs. He will provide us with a look at the Western Balkans and their impact of security in Europe, offering insights that will enrich our understanding of how the security policy of the European Union operates. We are truly grateful for Professor Bieber's presence here today and for the knowledge he is about to share. I encourage you to take full advantage of this session, ask questions, and contribute to the discussion. So I will stop here and I would like to give the floor to Professor Bieber, and we will start right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alina, for the kind introduction and having me on this discussion. It's been a pleasure over the last years to be a part of this. I'm also looking forward to your questions and comments. So I think we have an hour in total as far as I understand, and I would maybe speak for 20 minutes to half an hour, and then afterwards you can ask any questions. I was wondering whether I should have a PowerPoint, but then I decided I have a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to show it because we're also living in a moment when, unfortunately, global events shape our reality where, something I was teaching maybe a year ago is changing in a certain way. I mean, it seems banal to say, but, I think I would just, again, and after 3 years of Russian aggression, make sure to express my support for Ukraine and for the difficulties your country is facing, not just in the light of Russian aggression, but also in all of those who are not showing the solidarity the country deserves. And I hope either they will change their minds or those who do provide solidarity and support for Ukraine will prevail, just to be clear on this. And this brings me to the topic, the Western Balkans. So I would like to make a few observations. So we're talking about 6 countries which are not in the European Union. So you could say, well, who cares about European security for a region which, in comparison to Ukraine, is much smaller? It's maybe, in terms of population, a third of the size of Ukraine. But it's 6 countries, 6 countries which have been waiting to get into the European Union for now more than 20 years. The process to join the European Union for the Western Balkans began in 2003 in Thessaloniki at a summit of the European Union and the leaders of the Western Balkans. And yet only one country managed to join the European Union over this 22-year period, which is Croatia, which joined already 12 years ago. So one real important issue is the EU process and what it means and why is it taking so long. And I don't want to talk about EU enlargement, but from a security perspective. And then the other one is to talk a little bit about the changing global security environment and how it manifests itself in the Western Balkans. And then also to reflect in conclusion on what EU's perception and actions in global security means for the Western Balkans. So the first part reflects a little bit on the special security issues in the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans are a region which, with the exception of Albania, were all part of Yugoslavia. And the reason why they were not able to join the European Union with The other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which joined in 2004 and 2007, was, of course, the violent dissolution of the country in the 1990s, which did not just bring war and destruction, but also authoritarianism and unstable states. This made it impossible for the countries to begin joining at the time when Hungary, Slovenia, which was the only Yugoslav republic which was able to avoid longer war or isolation and could join early, but the others were not that lucky. So the region has a number of security concerns which both shaped EU enlargement, but also made it more difficult. So already the accession, the association agreements were called stabilization and association agreements, which already tells you that this was not just about EU accession, but also about stability. So EU engagement in the Western Balkans was also about providing for long-term stability and security in the region, which meant the idea that it would prevent a resumption of war in the countries. Now, so we're talking about several key security concerns. The first one is the internal stability of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia-Herzegovina being a country which was saved as a country in the Dayton Peace Accord, which celebrates its 30th anniversary this year in November, which was signed in Dayton, Ohio, in the US under US mediation and pressure to end the war. But that war had 100,000 victims and half of the population displaced. And it provided for a very weak country, one country which most observers say is too weak to join even the European Union in terms of its institutions. So this is the first larger security issue, which with the offer of EU membership was thought to be resolved. The second one was Serbia and Kosovo. As you know, the war in Kosovo came to an end in 1999 after the intervention of NATO, which ended the war with the withdrawal of Serbian security forces from Kosovo, and then less than 10 years later, in 2008, the declaration of independence of Kosovo as an independent country. Ever since, Serbia has not recognized the independence of Kosovo, neither have a number of other countries around the world, and there is an ongoing EU-mediated dialogue to address this. There have been recent and sporadic flares of violence and incidents in Kosovo, especially in the north, in the area where there is a Serb majority and where Serbian state institutions have some influence. So in the other countries of the Western Balkans, Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, there are no major security issues, but they are, of course, closely intertwined, linked to those countries which have these security issues. So the reason why enlargement takes so long is not because of the security issues, but the security issues make it more difficult. They make it more difficult for Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo, and they have knock-on effects for regional stability. Now, around 20 years ago, the expectation and hope was that EU membership would be enough to resolve these differences, would be enough to make Bosnia-Herzegovina a more integrated country, and would be enough to motivate Serbia and Kosovo to normalize relations so that they could both join the European Union. Now, what we know now is that this was not enough, that the EU itself had been a mediator as well. The EU is leading the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo now for 14 years, as well as having been involved in Bosnia-Herzegovina, trying to mediate some agreements which would strengthen the state and which would make it more easily compatible, able to join the European Union. None of this has been really, I would say, successful. And this means that the security concerns which existed 20 years ago, when the EU made the offer of membership to the Western Balkan countries, they remain acute, they remain relevant. In addition, there are a number of other bilateral issues across the region over how to deal with the past, recognizing war crimes, and border disputes which are unresolved. None of these are as serious as these larger security issues, but they show that the Western Balkans are not yet able to easily join the European Union. And the European Union has not been able, through the offer of membership, to address these security issues. So it tells two things. One is the limits or the limitations of what the European Union as an organization can do in addressing security concerns. It is much more effective in integrating countries on other issues, economically, politically, but it's much more struggling to address security challenges as serious as the ones of the wars of the 1990s. And of course, it's not the only ones. Another member state, Cyprus, which joined in 2004, was unable to resolve the division of the country ahead of membership, and the EU was unable, despite the offer of membership, to resolve the Cypriot division on time. So the EU has a limited ability to deal with such conflicts. And this is something we can see also in the Western Balkans. It also meant that the EU membership has become maybe less of a motivation for elites in some of the countries. We have, as a larger security concern, you could say, the rise of authoritarian governments, which is part of a global trend, not unique to the Western Balkans, which includes EU member states like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Erdogan in Turkey, and well beyond that. But the Western Balkans have been affected by this as well, which made EU accession more difficult. So the EU, it shows, I think, so the first kind of conclusion, the first part I would like to underline is the limitations of the EU in dealing with security challenges in the Western Balkans. Now, the second aspect, as I said, I would talk about would be about the impact of the European, of the larger security situation in the region now beyond. And what we're seeing is beyond the still unresolved security challenges in the Western Balkans, we're seeing also phenomena which observers have called the rise of global actors in the Western Balkans, namely that we've seen the influence of China, Russia, Turkey, and other countries rising in the Western Balkans over the last 10 years. This is manifested in a number of ways, and I'm not saying that the role of China and Russia is the same. They have different roles and different motivations, but all of them, of course, do not help to bring the countries closer to the European Union, because some of them, like Russia, of course, wants to disrupt the European Union. China does not want to disrupt the European Union, but offers money and policies which are in contradiction with the European Union or in conflict with the European Union. So what we can observe is that because these 6 countries have not joined the European Union, it has been easier for countries like China and Russia to gain influence. Now, to briefly give you a sense of the different types of influence, because I think it's important, Russia's influence in the Western Balkans is, of course, very different than Russia's influence aggression in Ukraine or influence in Moldova or in Georgia or in other countries which are closer to Russia. Russia is further away from the Western Balkans. It doesn't have Russian citizens or Russian speakers in large numbers in the Western Balkans to use as an argument or excuse for its intervention. But it has been mobilizing, in particular, solidarity among Serbs in the Western Balkans, to a large degree because there's a strong anti-Western sentiment among many Serbs in the Western Balkans, mostly because of the wars of the 1990s, based on the fact that NATO and the US intervened to stop the war in Bosnia and in Kosovo, which many Serbs see as unjust and unfair. So Russia is very successful in playing on anti-Western sentiments. And so Russia has been present in Serbia and Serbian-speaking parts of the Balkans through media like Sputnik and other propaganda stations. But also, more importantly, it's had local TV and newspapers which copy pro-Russian messages, even if they're not supported by Russia. They are doing it for their own reasons because of the Serbian government taking often a very pro-Russian line in terms of its public appearance. So So this current government in Serbia, as well as the leading politician of Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Milorad Dodik, are following a very pro-Russian arguments. They are anti-Western in their policies. They praise Russia. They praise Russian Orthodox alliances. The Serbian Orthodox Church is closely linked to the Russian Orthodox Church. And when, for example, Serbian media are reporting about the Russian aggression against Ukraine, they are often they are using terminology from the Russian propaganda. They sometimes are a bit confused. They sometimes use the word aggression and then they correct themselves, or they sometimes use, but they often use, they have used terms like special military operation in the past. They have used terms or ways in which President Zelensky or the Ukrainian government have been characterized by Russia. And they've also framed the war very much as a war between the West and Russia rather than as a war of aggression against Ukraine. These are themes you find in Serbian media nearly every day. Also, the Serbian media and the Serbian president have been talking about protests in their own country as colored revolution, and have taken very much the same line which Russian President Putin has been taking towards any dissent, not just in Russia, but elsewhere, as calling it colored revolutions and Western plots against governments. Russia has been active also economically, but very weakly, mostly in the energy sector. So Russia has been mostly in the region of the Western Balkans, a security disruptor. It's been trying to stop NATO membership of Montenegro and North Macedonia through disinformation campaigns and other activities. It failed in both cases. Both countries did join NATO, so it wasn't successful. So Russia is influential, but not that strong in the region. I would say it's been also getting weaker because of its own war it's leading against Ukraine, as well as because of its isolation, at least in Europe. Of course, it has still allies in Serbia. Serbia has not imposed sanctions on Russia, and one can still fly from Russia to Serbia, which is the only other country besides Turkey which has, at least in continental Europe, direct links in that way. With Russia. The other important actor in the region is China. China itself has not been such a disruptor as Russia has been, but China has been building very strong economic ties across the Western Balkans, investing in industry, they're opening factories, as well as investing or providing loans for infrastructure. None of this is inherently problematic, but the problem arises from a number of aspects. First of all, the way of these contracts is often very intransparent, and as a result raises the question that there might be corruption or abuse of office going on, and certainly makes it harder for the countries to join the European Union because it's intransparent. And there are also often disregard to environmental protection, to procurement and other rules. So that provides a security challenge in that sense. China has been also providing, for example, a surveillance technology to countries like Serbia, which have been using face recognition cameras and other technology also for political opponents. At least that's the report. So again, that Chinese involvement is less about stopping the countries from joining the European Union. In fact, China has good ties also to Hungary, but is more interested in getting political leverage and influence, which it can then use on the issues it cares about. And again, it is the strongest in the countries where Russia is strong, which is Serbia in particular, but it has also substantial investments in North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then we have other actors which have similar roles, like Turkey, mostly as an investor in the region, but also a very important political player, less disruptive, but still often intransparent, very unclear in its investment, just like investors also from the United Arab Emirates. Again, not a politically strong actor, but economically very powerful and very much involved in deals which have no transparency and which, again, undermine security and undermine, let's say, the Euro-Atlantic prospects of the region. So with that, you can see that these external actors have different motivations and different ways of acting in different countries. But in all of these ways, they often are going against let's say, the Euro-Atlantic integration, or European integration, I should say, because I'm not sure that we can talk about Atlantic integration after the election of Donald Trump to the American presidency. Of course, we're also seeing, and we have to, I think, ask ourselves whether the US is a disruptive actor in the Western Balkans. The US is no longer, unfortunately, a constructive player in the international system. It already in the Western Balkans during the first Trump presidency was disruptive because it did not act in agreement with the European Union. It promoted the idea, for example, of border changes between Serbia and Kosovo, which was seen by many in the EU as highly problematic, because if you start accepting the idea that borders can be changed, this sets a dangerous precedent, which I don't need to explain to you why. And so the US under Trump it has not been active now in the last month since Trump returned to the White House, because he's busy creating damage elsewhere. But from the point of view of expectation, one certainly expects that the US under Trump is also going to be a disruptive, not a positive security actor in the Western Balkans in the coming years. So, and that leaves me with the third part, which is trying to see what is the position, what is the region's place today in the larger security infrastructure of Europe. So first of all, of course, the region is, the 6 Western Balkan countries are actually divided into 2 sets. There are the NATO members of the Western Balkans and the non-NATO members. The NATO members are North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania. So when you're talking about the Western Balkans, in that sense, NATO is much, more integrating than the European Union. And so in that sense, you could say these countries are much more clearly oriented politically towards Europe and Western integration. Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. In the case of Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's different, but for different reasons. So Kosovo, of course, would like to join NATO, but is unable to do so because of 4 NATO member states who do not recognize Kosovo. So it's not that Kosovo has any different geopolitical orientation. In fact, it's probably the most, let's say, Western-oriented country in the Western Balkans. But because of the blockage, Spain, Greece, Romania, and Slovakia are the 4 countries in NATO which don't recognize Kosovo, and Cyprus is the 5th country, which is EU member state but not NATO member, which is also not recognizing Kosovo. So that's what's blocking Kosovo. So its foreign policy is very much aligned with the European Union. It's not different. Bosnia-Herzegovina is very divided. So we have the majority of population, the Bosniak population, and the Croat population, which is clearly looking towards the European Union, which would like to see Bosnia in the European Union and in NATO, according to all opinion polls. But the Serb population, which makes up around 1/3 of the country's citizens, does not shares the anti-Western sentiment of many, not maybe of a substantial number of Serbs in Serbia itself. So Bosnia, in that sense, has often been struggling to take decisions. So, for example, when sanctions were imposed against Russia, Bosnia initially had a hard time setting up those sanctions, not because the majority of citizens was against the sanctions, but because of the complicated structure of the country makes it hard to take a decision. And the Serb leaders in Bosnia were opposed to sanctions against Russia. So Bosnia, I would say, is a divided country when it comes to its geopolitical orientation, while Serbia is overwhelmingly against joining NATO and even no longer in favor of joining the European Union. But I would argue that this anti-Western orientation of Serbia is very much linked to the current regime of Aleksandar Vučić, who is very anti-Western, while at the same time engaged in official accession negotiations with the EU. He is promoting Russian and Russian-style messages domestically. He's doing this strategically for his own power, but he's meant, under his rule, support for EU has dropped from 70%, around 70%, to around 40%. And this is very much based on anti-Western messages in media and in public statements. But then again, we've seen in Serbia now the longest serious protest movement in Serbia for decades, with hundreds of thousands going on the street over the last last months since November. These have nothing to do with Serbia's geopolitical orientation, but it's about rule of law and democracy. Citizens protest over corruption and abuse of office. And while the protesters don't have EU flags or are not sending pro-EU messages, it is not because they're against the values of the European Union, but it's because they feel the EU is supporting the current government, despite its anti-Western messages. So it's a bit different than the situation in Georgia, where the protesters feel the EU supports them. In Serbia, many EU leaders have made very profitable business arrangements with the current government, and that means that the protesters don't think the EU's on their side, but the content of their messages is very critical to Vučić. So whether or not this anti-Western sentiment in Serbia will survive the government of Vučić is, I think, doubtful. I would say that Serbia has at least a substantial part of the citizen who is in favor of Western integration. It's just that they have been in a certain way surrounded by a very intense propaganda by their government. But again, we don't know yet whether this government will survive this politically. So in that sense, we have the region which is divided between, clearly countries integrated in European security structures and aligned with European foreign policy. And you have countries which are struggling with it. And there I would say Serbia is the main player because it shapes also the policy of pro-Serbian parties in Montenegro, as well as of Serbian politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if that was to change, it would change the whole dynamic in the region. In terms of the larger European security environment, certainly these 6 countries not being in the European Union provides opportunities for abuse by external actors, as I've mentioned, as well as more authoritarianism, which we're seeing in the region, which again are looking for allies in global geopolitical actors like China, Turkey, and Russia. So in a certain way, the disappointment has been that despite the European Union regaining focus after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, full-scale invasion 2022, with offering accession talks to Ukraine, to Moldova, there hasn't been such a dramatic shift in the Western Balkans. The countries which were pro-Western before stayed pro-Western, and those who were skeptical stayed skeptical. There's not been a major change across the board. I think one of the key questions I have for myself now is whether or not the breakdown of the Euro-Atlantic alliance between the US and the European Union, what will be the impact on security and on the Western Balkans? I have, we can see the countries in the region struggling of how to position themselves. Most of them, because they're not in the European Union, feel they can't alienate the US all the way. So some of them are trying to keep good ties with the US at the moment, but that's, going to be more and more difficult to do both. And this is something which will be a major security question. We find certainly the more authoritarian governments like Serbia looking towards Trump as an ally. For example, Serbia has been searching key critical NGOs in the last week under the pretext that they received money from USAID. And the prosecutor's office used Trump's speeches as an argument of why they should investigate them. His critique of USAID was used as an argument why they might be merit investigation. So there you can see how a country like Serbia might be moving more towards a Trump America and moving away from Europe, while others might be moving more towards the European Union. And of course, a lot will depend on how much the EU is able to offer an alternative security infrastructure, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe more broadly, as we're seeing that NATO as an alliance is challenged by the lack of certainty of what the US would do if an alliance member was under threat. So the future security arrangements and the part of the Western Balkans in Europe remains very unsure, as the whole European security is unsure these days. But I think we can be quite clear that the majority of the countries of the Western Balkans will see their future in the European security arrangements. And those who look at more towards Washington are those who were looking towards Moscow before or towards Beijing. And that's because they are trying to keep up an authoritarian system of government, which they can get more support from those leaders who themselves are not Democrats, at least not in their own behavior or spirit. So I think this gives us a quick, very quick, sorry for this very maybe intense and maybe too much information or rundown, but we can now take some time to discuss any questions you might have or anything you might be curious about.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Professor Bieber, for your talk. And I would like to open the floor for discussion. Maybe our students, yeah, I can see the first hand. And please, Maria, take your floor for the question.
Okay, thank you. I haven't got an opportunity to turn on my camera. So thank you for the comprehensive lecture. And I have two questions. And first one about the accession of one country from the Western Balkans, like Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we know that this country have majority of people who have Muslim religion, yeah, and despite this fact, can this country be a part of the EU? Because we know that Turkey, I don't know, but maybe from 20s, maybe in that period of time, they have the I forget the word. They have their application to join to the EU, so it's possible to for Bosnia and Herzegovina take a part of the EU or not because of their religion factor.
Yes. Okay. So I think I would first of all, I mean, there's nothing stopping a country with a majority Muslim population to join the European Union, and there's nothing in the EU, and it shouldn't be, of course, because the EU is open to all countries which are democratic and in Europe. I would say, of course, when it comes to Turkey, there were some countries or some, let's say, rather citizens of some EU countries, which are there are some strong anti-Muslim tendencies in some European countries. But so that was one of the reasons why Turkey was stopped. There are other reasons. I mean, Turkey is not a democracy at the moment, but also it's a very big country, and again, it's bigger than Ukraine in terms of population, and having a big country join the EU is always difficult. It's also a country which borders on Iraq, on Iran, on Syria, which also for the EU is a challenge. So there were other reasons as well. I think I'll give you the example of Austria. And Austria, for example, has been quite against, the citizens are very much against Turkey joining. Like 70% of citizens say that Turkey should not join the European Union. And in Austria, there's a very strong anti-Muslim sentiment. But at the same time, in Austria, the country they support most to join the European Union, of the Western Balkan countries, is Bosnia. And this is because there are lots of Bosnian citizens living, or people who are from Bosnia living in Austria, including the former Minister of Justice of Austria came as a refugee to Austria. So Austrians know Bosnians very well and are very familiar and have a lot less stereotypes. It's also because many Bosnian Muslims are very secular, and so these cultural arguments don't really work for Bosnia because most Bosnian Muslims, don't have very different traditions than most other people in the Western Balkans, are not very religious, not very dogmatic with their Islam. So I don't think there's a problem with that for Bosnia to join.
Thank you, I understand. And my second question, what does Kosovo like to be recognized by mostly EU countries? Maybe some political factor or economical factor like corruption, something like that.
So why Kosovo was not recognized, you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, because the issue is that because Kosovo, when it declared its independence from Serbia, Serbia did not accept its independence, and all the other countries which emerged from Yugoslavia were republics, and all of the republics, there was already the observation in 1991, just like the Soviet Union, that the republics have a right to become independent. This, when there was the agreement between the leaders of Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine, and then later on Belarus, that to dissolve the Soviet Union. This was not done in Yugoslavia, but there was an agreement by the European Union as well to say the republics have a right to become independent. But Kosovo was not a republic, had a different status. And so when it became independent, it didn't have that argument. And this is why many countries, including Ukraine, have not recognized Kosovo's independence, because they worry that it sets a precedent for their own territories or minorities. I don't think that is the case, because I think Kosovo was a very special case. It was a province in Yugoslavia. It wasn't a republic, but it was a province, so it had a higher status than other places. There was a ethnic cleansing and massive human rights violations by Serbia, and Kosovo was under international administration with a special UN mandate. So that is different than other places. So I think there is an argument why one should recognize Kosovo, but this is the reason why Kosovo is, not universally recognized, unlike Montenegro, let's say, or North Macedonia.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your questions, Maria, and for your answer, Professor Biba. And as I saw, the second hand was from the Alexander. Please, Alexander, take your floor for a question.
Thank you. Mr. Bieber, you have said about Russian and Chinese influence on the countries of Balkans, which is economic ties, propaganda, religion. So I wanted to ask, how do you think, what is the best way to stop such influence and prevent its future spread?
Yes, thanks. I mean, it's, of course, I would say in terms of propaganda, a lot of the propaganda is coming from the governments themselves, as I was mentioning. So, for example, in Serbia, the most pro-Russian propaganda comes from the president and from his party. So they, of course, don't want to stop this propaganda. So this is the problem. And I would say even there, even if, there would be no Sputnik or no RT existing, it wouldn't change the propaganda, because a lot of the propaganda comes from media controlled by the government. So in that sense, you could say the only way to stop it with a government which is not pro-Russian. I mean, very, very, very simple. I mean, it sounds a bit too easy, but that's the only way to stop it, really. If you have a government which is pro-Russian, it's really hard to stop it. I mean, I think the EU could put more pressure on Serbia to, I think it's a problem that a country says they want to join the European Union and at the same time have no sanctions against Russia, but also, for example, talk about colored revolution as a threat. President Vučić gave a speech 2 weeks ago saying, I will write a bestseller of how to defeat colored revolutions, and will sell 10 million copies in China of how to destroy colored revolutions. If you say that, I mean, I don't think you should be in the European Union or even a candidate country, to be honest. But it's hard to stop. Now, of course, when it comes to investments, it's more tricky. I mean, there are Chinese investments in the European Union as well, right? And some of it is totally fine. I think what is the issue is that they have to be transparent and they have to be working according to the rules of rule of law. So, you know, in Croatia, for example, a very big bridge was built by a Chinese company which won a tender. There was a public tender, there was a normal process, and Chinese company won. And then they had to build it according to the standards of the country, and that's, you know, that's okay. It's very different when you have you build a highway in Montenegro or North Macedonia, where it's a state contract, is a secret. A lot of the companies which build then are hired by Chinese companies without a tender, without public information on who gets what kind of money, and that's a problem. So basically, the best way to counter it is not to say you shouldn't have Chinese investments, but to say they have to be all by transparent standards. There have to be environmental protection, there has to be public procurement, it all has to be by the same standards, and Chinese companies shouldn't be privileged, because this is what's happening, that Chinese companies make these direct deals with prime ministers or presidents where nobody knows exactly what's going on. And this is then a much bigger problem than the fact that it's Chinese money, so to speak. Of course, also, you know, other issues are more problematic. I mean, I think Huawei technology, for example, in public, you know, in cameras in public spaces is a problem. I think that, you know, I think EU countries wouldn't be able to do this because this would be seen as being a problem for security and privacy considerations.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Bieber.
Thank you very much for your question and for your answer. And please, the next question from Christina, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bieber, for such an informative lecture. And I have a question about what lessons can be drawn from international peacekeeping and state-building efforts in the Western Balkans for future European security operations.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the two peacekeeping operations in the region are still there in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. Both have security peacekeepers. In Bosnia, it's an EU-led mission. In Kosovo, it's a NATO-led mission. And they're there, you know, 20 years, well, 30 years nearly after the end of the war. So that's maybe a bad sign that they're there so long. Or maybe it's a good sign that they're able to stay there for so long and nobody's able to push them out, or, you know. I mean, I think certainly one of the problems you see is that if, you know, I would say to some degree, the conflicts were frozen, were not fully politically resolved. And I think this is a problem that then becomes harder to resolve as time goes by, because you get a status quo, which is very hard to change. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, one of the key lessons is that the Dayton Peace Agreement included the constitution of the country, which is still the constitution of the country today. And that was clearly a mistake. Having a constitution for a country in a peace agreement was the wrong time, because it made it, first of all, a very weak constitution, and one which really citizens didn't have much to say in, and it freezes the conflict in many ways. I think if one had I think what you have in conflicts after Bosnia is having maybe more an interim constitution or some kind of process which leads to a permanent constitution, which is more inclusive than what we have in Bosnia. So that is certainly one of the lessons, not to have a constitution so quickly or as a part of the package to end a war. Also having these territories under control of a particular ethnic group as a way to end the war can be very problematic in the long term, because it can be a source of instability and also blocking. In Bosnia, it blocks the decisions of the country. In Kosovo, it also allows Serbia to have influence in Kosovo in a way which is not always transparent. The hope was in both cases that with the EU integration and with time, it would be easier to resolve some of those issues, that they would be too hard to resolve immediately. So for example, it was quite clear I remember in 2000 talking to policy analysts and experts who said, it was quite clear that Kosovo would not come back under Serbian control already in 2000. But then people said, well, it's too early to talk about the final status of Kosovo. Let's wait, let's make it later. And the result was in 2008, it was harder because in 2000, Serbia was still controlled by Milosevic. So you could have said, well, he lost the war, it's his fault, Kosovo should be independent. 8 years later, it was harder to justify because at the time Serbia had a democratic government. You didn't want to alienate them. So this actually made it harder. And then also recognition harder because the war had been in a certain way already fading in their memory. So I think sometimes one of the lessons I would say is sometimes decisions need to be done quickly after the war, and they've been postponed in many cases because it seemed easier to wait than to deal with them right away. And I think that was often a mistake, which made normalization a country which is not a post-conflict country, but a country which can move on much harder. So I would say these are some of the kind of very important lessons from the experience, because again, today we're in a situation where those two largest wars of the 90s are unresolved. I mean, Bosnia is not functioning as a country, and Kosovo is not able to be fully independent from Serbia yet. Although, those were the same conflicts 30 years ago, and, we don't have a war in the region, but we haven't resolved the underlying political issues. And this is, I think, the problem. One needs to resolve, one needs to just not just stop the fighting, but also make sure that the political issues underlying them are resolved, because otherwise they keep being there and keep making normality difficult.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question and for the answer, Professor Bibba. And maybe we have
next
more
question.
questions.
We have Anastasia Kulik. Anastasia, you're welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I quickly introduce myself. My name is Anastasia. I'm first-year student of international relations, and I would love to say thank you for interesting and knowledge lecture. My question is, how could an economic crisis in the Western Balkans increase security risks to Europe, especially to Ukraine?
So you're particularly interested in the economic crisis. I mean, I think first of all, you have to keep in mind the Western Balkans are 70 million people, and it has the economy of Slovakia altogether. So in terms of economic power, it's quite low. It's not important in the European sense. I mean, I say the EU could include these countries and nobody would even notice, I mean, in the EU, in terms of economic and people, unlike Ukraine, which is a bigger economy and many more citizens. So the economic situation in the region is already, it's not a crisis, but it's not been great because the Western Balkans have not received investments in the way they were hoping, partly because they're relatively small markets, partly because there are lots of issues with rule of law and corruption. So I don't think there's, I think that the main challenge for Europe is not the economy of the countries. I mean, of course, the difficulty is actually what we see. If a country is in the European Union, they get such a substantial increase in their GDP because of membership, partly through funding mechanisms like structural funds and other financial means, but also through investments, because there are lots of investors which are waiting for EU membership. And you can see countries which joined, like Croatia or Romania, Bulgaria, and look at their GDP development since they joined, and the Western Balkans, and they're getting far apart. The gap is getting bigger because the Western Balkans isn't getting that investment or that kind of funds from the EU. So in a certain way, I think the risk is not economic crisis, but what economists have observed, that to catch up with the EU, even not with the rich countries, but just with the average, is getting harder and will take decades. And this is, I think, the challenge. And I don't think that's a security challenge. I mean, it's a security challenge down the road, because of course, what happens already now is that citizens are leaving. I mean, tens of thousands of citizens from the Western Balkans are leaving every year because of lack of economic, but also other prospects. Because many citizens don't want to pay bribes, they don't want to join a political party anymore, all of that. So a lot of young people, nowadays we're having a situation where actually you don't find people anymore to do jobs in the countries because people have left to Austria, to Germany, to other EU countries. And so you need to import labor from Nepal, from Cuba, from other countries to do the jobs in tourism or in the hospitality sector. And that creates all kinds of strange situations in terms of economic growth. So I think all of that does not have a direct, I don't think this will have any repercussion for Ukraine or even Europe more broadly. But of course, a bad economic situation and stagnation is more likely to make a security issue more relevant. You know, conflict is more likely to happen in an economically bad situation. So this is more the risk, but I don't think that the economy as such is a challenge for Europe or, you know, or Ukraine as part of that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your question and for the answer. And let me ask as well, Professor Bібер, how do you think such a long process of the European integration of the Balkan countries hurts more influence of the geopolitical influence of the European Union, security of the European Union, or unstable democracies of the Balkan region? And the second question, how do you think not to turn the European integration of the Balkan countries into a dead deal, as happened with Turkey?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Alina. I mean, I think I think one of the lessons, of course, is that I think the EU has been too slow in integrating the countries. That it should have been faster. I mean, not allowing countries to be authoritarian, but countries which were more democratic 10 years ago or so, to bring them faster into the European Union, to offer them the prospect. Because we see now, one of the lessons is if you wait too long, countries don't get better. You know, I think something in the EU that, of course, the EU was occupied with other issues. There were a lot of challenges well before the Russian aggression. There was, the economic crisis of 2008, the Eurozone crisis with the Greek financial crisis. There was Brexit. So there were all these challenges which distracted the actions, were painful, but also costly, because you lost the momentum when the EU could have maybe, because, I mean, if you're a democratically elected leader, you're thinking of your own elections and re-elections. And if the EU says, well, you know, you're going to join in 15 years, you know, it's not a very good motivation to do everything necessary to bring your country in the EU. And I think this has been partly the problem. The EU was not offering a concrete enough time horizon and realizing when you had good partners that they would be better than the alternatives. So I think one thing I always say is you have to seize the moment. If there's a moment of leadership which is pro-European and interested, one has to reward it, encourage it, and provide incentives to complete the process, because otherwise, exactly, you risk ending up with a situation like Turkey, which is then a country which is outside of the EU with nobody interested in joining either in the EU side or on the side of Turkey. I think this is not desirable for any country or the European Union. So the EU has, I think, understood that a little bit. There's now an effort to at least move with Albania and Montenegro as two countries which have no big problems. I mean, there are lots of problems with rule of law, but, you know, on the larger scale, it might be, you know, good to move them faster to the European Union. And people talking about that those two countries might join before the end of the decade. And that would certainly kind of open the door again, or say, okay, you know, membership can happen, because this is at the moment a bit, if you go to the Western Balkan, citizens are very cynical about the EU, because they say, oh, we've been in this for 20 years and it's not happening, it's not moving. So is this ever going to end? And I think this is the thing which one has to get out of, because if citizens don't believe it anymore, then they will not pressure their own government to deliver. They will not because then they don't say it's going to happen. So why try? But if citizens say, hey, we can do it, they will say to their governments in elections, you better get our country in because I know we can, and we can be member in 5 years or in 8 years. And this changes the whole internal political dynamics. And this is something which the EU lost a little bit in the Western Balkans. And it requires really this kind of pressure in the EU side and together with the citizens to really kind of push for the reforms and push for the changes. And then you create this momentum, this sense of direction, and that there's an end point, that that's not like an eternal, never-ending story. So I think this is one of the big failures in the Western Balkans, that the EU dragged it out for too long, and at some point, nobody cares and believes it anymore. And so you have to restore trust in this process. And I think this is, I think already, circumstances were extraordinary for Ukraine, and as a result, it also helped Moldova. But I think it was good not to wait these early stages, these early stages from becoming a candidate to starting accession talks. These things have taken many years in the Western Balkans, and they've taken, a very short period of time in Ukraine. And I think that's, some people in the Western Balkans are a bit resentful. They say Ukraine got special treatment, but I think it was a good choice, not just for Ukraine, but also saying that not to wait for these things, but to really move forward decisively when the time is right. And I think that is one of the lessons also of the experience from the Western Balkans.